Welcome back to the War Zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. After a lot of Ukraine videos, I figured it was time for something else, and we will take a look at the Swedes who fought on. When the Winter War was over, the Swedish forces in Finland returned home, but some stayed to fight on. And Sweden during World War II is a subject that is very much misunderstood by most people. Very few realize what Sweden did and how Sweden actually participated and took an active part in World War II. Uh, the thing is that Sweden managed to avoid being invaded, and for some reason, people are upset about that. I'm not sure why. Every country in Europe at the time tried to avoid being invaded. Most of them failed, but Sweden managed it, and somehow that makes Sweden bad. I don't know. Anyway, so I've made a couple of videos, but first dealing with the Sweden and the Winter War. But first off, yes, Sweden had a close connection with Finland. Obviously, after Finland had been Swedish territory, Swedish part of Swedish kingdom and empire for 600 years or something, up until the 19th century, 1809, when Russia grabbed Finland from Sweden. And because of that, Swedes felt a strong connection with the Finns. And when the Winter War began, um propaganda spread across Sweden, uh, promoting Finlands sak är vår, which translates to Finland's cause is ours, right? It was a call for Sweden to stand up for Finland and to support and help Finland. And Sweden very much was in favor of helping Finland, both the civilian population, both the military, and the government. The government, on the other hand, had this problem that they had to try and keep Sweden out of any conflict. They didn't want Swedish citizens getting bombed, and they didn't want Swedish soldiers to get involved in something that could escalate to a war. So they came up with this sneaky plan, the Volunteer Corps, where you gathered funds through charity, gave those charity money to Finland, and Finland used the charity funds to buy weapons from the Swedish army. And we're talking machine guns, we're talking anti-aircraft guns, we're talking mortars, artillery, you name it, everything a proper Swedish fighting force would have needed to wage war. And on top of that, they gave permission to Swedish soldiers and Swedish officers, 500 officers, high-ranking officers as well. They gave them permission to go on leave and join the volunteer corps. And then you recruited soldiers and you recruited volunteers and put them through strict tests and asked them a lot of questions and vetted these volunteers very strictly until you had a fighting force of around 9,000 men, plus 500 Swedish officers. And they were equipped with the weapons and supplies and everything that Finland had bought using the charity funds, right? So, no, 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 it wasn't the Swedish army. Sweden did not at all send a force of 9,500 troops into Finland. No, no, they were volunteers. And Sweden, the Swedish army did not supply the weapons because Finland happened to supply them that they just had previously bought from Sweden like a month before. I mean, what a coincidence, right? So no, 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 the Swedish army did not at all take an active part in the Winter War. Yes, it did. This was a sneaky, sneaky way for Sweden to deploy its army into Finland without Sweden itself actively taking part in the conflict. And it didn't end with the army. Sweden actually deployed a third of its air force to Finland: planes, pilots, ground crew. fuel, ammo, supplies, spare parts, you name it. A full third of the Air Force was moved from Sweden to Finland and put under Finnish command, and they were understandably attached to the Swedish Volunteer Corps. So you had a Swedish army unit supported by the Swedish Air Force operating in the far north of Finland in the middle of winter, right during the Winter War. Of course, Sweden did not take an active part in World War II and did not take an active part in the Winter War fighting the Soviet Union. Not at all. Yeah, just happy coincidences all around. This was not at all sanctioned by the government, and the Volunteer Corps, together with the Air Force, had not at all in any shape, way, or form contact throughout the Winter War with Swedish High Command. No, 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 not at all. The Air Force famously denied Russia the ability to properly do aerial reconnaissance, and they also prevented Russia from doing close air support, denied Russian dive bombers and low-flying fighters to attack Finnish and Swedish positions. So the Russians had to relying on heavy bombers that flew at a much higher altitude, dropping bombs that, of course, was way less accurate than dive bombers and close air support, as you can imagine. So the Air Force did a massive job in northern Finland, supporting Finnish troops and Swedish forces by actively hunting down Russian aircraft. And yeah, I've made a brief video about this, Sweden's Winter War, and I also made a video about the Grafström raid. An incredible story. 90 Jaegers, Swedish Rangers, basically, went in behind the Soviet lines to, that's the dog walking around in the background, behind Soviet lines to gather intelligence and to do sabotage. That's what Jaegers do. They were discovered. A scouting mission went wrong. They were discovered, and the Russians could follow the ski tracks back to the Swedish base camp. And then all hell broke loose. The Swedes found themselves surrounded by 600 Soviet soldiers. Remember, the Swedes were 95 when the shootout started. And the firefight lasted 5 hours. And at the end, the Swedes ran out of ammunition, and the Soviets prepared to charge into the Swedish base camp. And that is when Lieutenant Grafström, who was in command of this Jaeger operation, gave the order to fix bayonets. And then the Swedes went on the attack. So check that out. Hope I'll remember to provide a link to these two videos. But so yeah, Sweden took an active part in the Winter War, no doubt about it, and throughout World War II as well. And people who claim otherwise don't know what the fuck they're talking about, basically. Anyway, moving on to what happened after the Winter War. So the continuation war starts on the 26th of June 1941, when the Finns decide to reclaim lost territory that Russia had taken from them in the Winter War. Remember, there was a ceasefire, peace talks, and the Russians demanded to grab 10% from Finland, and the Finns accepted to have peace. And then they built up their forces again, made a deal with Germany to work side by side against their common enemy. This did not make the Finns Nazis. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was that sort of deal. You know, they needed an ally to reclaim territory that had been stolen by Russia, and Germany happened to show up and tell the Finns that I can be your huckleberry, and so that's why. So no, Finland wasn't fascist or Nazis or anything. So just stop it. Goddamn pro-Russian vatniks. Anyway, so Swedish volunteers begin to show an interest to join the war once again. And once more, only the most suitable were allowed to journey to Finland, so they started the vetting process once again. And once again, Swedish officers and soldiers joined uh, this new force. And on the 10th of August 1941, the Swedish volunteers were formed into a battalion, 800 men strong. They had been slowly gathering forces, and then when they were around 800 men, they said, fine, let's get this thing moving. We can now organize a proper military formation. And a week later, on the 17th of August, the Swedes were positioned on the contact line along the Hangö front, in the far south of Finland, a battle to conquer a Russian navy base along the coast. So part of the peace deal between Finland and Soviets was that Russia could have this base at Hangö along the Bay of Finland, right? So not only did Finland lose 10% of land in the east, they also had to give up this important town and navy base. And this battle was, to be fair, mostly fought with artillery and snipers. If you read the diaries from the Swedes who took part, they constantly mention flares at night that guide in mortars and artillery strikes all throughout the night, and snipers. A Russian sniper was known as the Phantom, and he was known to use explosive bullets and hitting people in the head. And a couple of Swedes died thanks to this sniper, the Phantom, and his explosive bullets taking hits to the head. Gruesome. But there were clashes between infantry, but they were kind of few and far between to a certain extent. This was mainly people holding their positions, artillery exchanging fire, and snipers hunting people that dared to stick their head out of cover. The battalion, unlike the volunteer corps, was not indirectly supported by the Swedish armed forces. As such, it was armed and organized by the Finnish army. The Swedish officers eventually took matters into their own hands and reorganized their battalion according to Swedish standards, primarily how to more effectively arrange and control the battalion's heavy and support weapons. The Finns had nothing against this change, since it was considered that a Swedish rifle company was very well thought out and suited for combat in its organization. The Finns gave the Swedes permission that if the Swedes were ordered to charge Russian positions, to do so according to Swedish doctrine rather than the structures of the Finnish army. The Swedish battalion would stay on the front line for 5 weeks, then was rotated out for 14 days, and then returned. The Swedes now remained on the front for 8 weeks straight. Every day artillery was aimed at the Swedes, sometimes sporadic, sometimes relentless. And this battalion, the volunteer battalion that became known as the Hangö Battalion, was not your ordinary gathering of volunteers. It was a mix of boys and men, where the youngest were 17 and the oldest 46. Everyone had received military training in Sweden. The battalion also had an excess number of NCOs within its ranks from the Swedish army, meaning many units had experienced and well-disciplined NCOs spread out between the squads as soldiers. This meant that the Swedish battalion was a highly elite and very capable fighting force, with young and eager soldiers being guided by many older and experienced leaders throughout the organization. Both Swedish and Finnish observers pointed out that even if the Swedes weren't as experienced as their Finnish counterparts, they did not lack in courage. Fool's courage, some might say, because the inexperience of actual combat sometimes meant the Swedes made decisions that were a bit dangerous, a bit reckless, but still they followed through with great courage. On the 3rd of December 1941, the Russians abandoned Hangö, and on the morning of the 4th of December, it was the Swedish battalion that was first to enter into Hangö after having successfully made their way through minefields on top of it all. And at 0800 it was Captain Gravström, who had commanded the troops during the Gravström raid the year before, who gave the order to raise the Finnish flag over Hangö. As the flag was hoisted, the Swedes called out, "Gud bevare Finland." God save Finland. On the 18th of December 1941, the Swedish Volunteer Battalion was relieved of duty and disbanded. Those soldiers who wanted to stay and fight were more than welcome to do so. Upon the return to Stockholm, the Hangö Battalion was greeted by cheering crowds. During the battle, 25 Swedes had died and 75 had been wounded. And next we will take a look at the Volunteer Company, also known as the Svir Company. The Swedish Volunteer Company was formed by the men who decided to stay and fight after the Hangö Battalion was disbanded. The company was attached to the Finnish 13th Infantry Regiment and deployed to the Svir front line between the lakes Ladoga and Onega. Throughout its existence, a total of 412 Swedes served in the Svir Company. On average, the company totaled 160 men strong at any given time, and the soldiers served around 9 months before being released from service. That said, 9 Swedes did serve in the company from its creation to the time it was disbanded. The Svir Company took part in a historic battle not far from the town of Viborg, a town that up until 1809 had been part of the Swedish kingdom, but was then lost to Russia. It was at the 2 villages of Tali and Ihantala between the 25th of June and the 9th of July 1944 that the Soviet Union tried to break through Finnish lines at these 2 villages. The Finns had a force of 50,000 troops holding the line, and the Russians attacked with 150,000 men. The largest battle ever fought on Nordic soil in history. The Battle of Tali-Ihantala was stacked in the Soviets' favor. The Soviet infantry outnumbered the Finns by 3-1. The tanks outnumbered the Finnish armor by 5-1, and looking at artillery, the Finns were outnumbered 6-1. And in the skies, the Soviets could field 15 aircraft for every plane fighting for Finland. On day 1 of the main Soviet advance, the Soviets opened fire with 6,000 artillery pieces. Within a few days, they had broken through the 2 first Finnish defensive lines. The Soviet Union then quickly secured the town of Viborg, a coastal town that has had strategical importance for centuries, and now the road into Finland appeared wide open. It was here that the Soviets would run into the 2 villages of Tali and Ihantala as they pushed on from Viborg. The Soviets ran into trouble at the river that served as Finland's 3rd defensive line, with Soviet engineers being bombarded by German dive bombers. Forced to cross on boats, the Soviets could now only rely on infantry. Each time they tried to assault across the water, the Soviets were repelled with massive casualties as a result. Devastating artillery barrages were aimed at the Finnish positions, followed by huge waves of Soviet infantry trying to cross on boats. But each time, the Finns held the line and held their side of the river. For a full week, the Soviets tried to time and time again to cross the river, but each time they failed. The river was soon filled with broken boats, splintered wood, and dead bodies that floated downstream. The Svir Company lost its company commander during these engagements, as he was killed by artillery while on the radio, relaying a report to his commanding officers. Further inland, the Soviets prepared another advance and began with a massive artillery campaign that was followed by large numbers of Soviet infantry and armor pushing in. This push was, however, eventually stopped by Finland's first armored assault. The Finnish tanks took the Russians by surprise and forced them to retreat. The Soviets tried several more assaults but were met by Finnish counterattacks at every turn. On the 9th of July 1944, the battle was over and the Soviets abandoned their attempts at pushing into Finland. The Finns had lost almost 9,000 men, but only 3 tanks and 45 aircraft. The Soviets had lost 27,500 troops, 600 tanks, and 300 aircraft. The surprising amount of tank losses was thanks to the Finns using German-supplied Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. In a single engagement, the Finns destroyed 25 Russian tanks with these capable weapons. The Svir Company was disbanded on the 26th of September 1944. By then, the Swedish company had suffered 39 dead and 84 wounded during its service in the Finnish army along the deadly front lines. And the company had taken part in the largest battle ever fought in the north. And on the subject of Swedish soldiers taking part in incredible military operations, I have to highlight a video of mine because it details an incredible true story when Sweden sent UN soldiers down to the Congo, and a couple of Swedish soldiers were handpicked to take part in an elite task force put together by the United Nations with the goal of rescuing missionaries, nuns, priests, school teachers, what have you, from a violent and brutal cannibal horde. And that's not all. The cannibals were communists. Yes, Swedish soldiers in the Congo fought communist cannibals. It happened. It's real. And I made a video about it. It's incredible. So we'll provide a link to this. It's just amazing. It should be a movie. Let's put it that way. So a link will be provided. I've even made a trailer just for the hell of it. So how about I provide the link for the trailer? You watch the trailer, and then you can click the link to the video in the trailer link thing. How about that? That's what we're gonna do. But yeah, Congo aside, Sweden did take a very active part in the Winter War, less so in the Continuation War, because at the time the Germans were pushing up through Norway, and we had to secure our own borders and everything like that. So we could no longer support Finland in the same way, unfortunately. So, but yes, before that, during the Winter War, Sweden decided to deploy its army and air force to Finland through some sneaky shenanigans to make it look like, no, we're not doing this officially. But we did our part, and the Swedish troops put up one hell of a fight up in the north of Finland, 40 degrees below freezing, snow up to the waist. I mean, hellish conditions in the middle of winter. But that's gonna have to be it. That's gonna have to be the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I'll see you in the next one. And remember, släpp ingen jävel över bron. See you around.